Joining me now is Mary Ziegler. She is the Stearns Weaver Miller Professor at Florida State University College of Law. She specializes in the legal history of reproduction, the family, sexuality, and the Constitution. She teaches courses in torts, family law, employment, and constitutional law. And she has a new book out called Abortion in America, a legal history of Roe v. Wade to the present. Mary, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
I've had a chance to dig into your book and just kind of dig into the conversations that you've been having about this topic. And one of the things that struck me is that perhaps we on the left, progressives, we may be oversimplifying the abortion issue in terms of how the decision would be made if this ever comes back up before the Supreme Court. Could you expand on how we should view, how should we view as progressives or just people in general, the abortion argument?
Well, I think one of the things that's probably striking if people were following the Supreme Court's latest big abortion decision, the Louisiana case June Medical versus Russo, I think a lot of progressives and a lot of people in general were probably confused by what the court was actually talking about. There's very little conversation about a right to choose or about equality for women or any of the stuff that progressives usually think about when they think about abortion. Instead, the court really seems to be kind of in the weeds talking about issues like, what is abortion in Louisiana different from Texas, or what does precedent mean? And all of that is by design. The anti-abortion movement really since the 1970s figured out that talking about a right to life or a right to choose was a losing proposition for conservatives, and that it instead made much more sense to focus on what abortion in America was really like, and even to argue that abortion was actually bad for women and pregnant people, which has been a strategy that's been very effective for conservatives for decades, really since the Hyde Amendment and beyond.
And you actually wrote an opinion for Market Watch on that recent decision. You said that the Supreme Court ruling on the Louisiana abortion case wasn't a big win for pro-choice advocates after all. Could you help us to understand that?
Yeah, well, I think John Roberts kind of pulled a fast one on progressives in some ways. He, of course, joined his more liberal colleagues in striking down the Louisiana law. And he did so by writing this kind of almost love song to precedent, right? Which we all have sort of learned to equate with Roe v. Wade. When Susan Collins had her sort of famous tete-a-tete with Brett Kavanaugh, where he reassured her, all they were talking about was precedent, which was code for Roe v. Wade. But when you dig into what Chief Justice Roberts did in this June Medical case, he actually effectively partially overruled precedent to get to the result he wanted. And he did it in a way that rolled back protection for abortion rights in future cases. And we already know this because he sent back 2 big wins for abortion rights to a lower court to revisit with his lower, less protective standard in place. So going forward, we don't know how much exactly the court is going to do when it comes back to scaling back abortion rights, but we know they're going to be less protected than they were before this decision.
It's interesting because I was one of the people who celebrated John Roberts and felt like, wow, maybe perhaps he isn't the extremist that we painted him to be over the years. I remember and recall back to his appointment during the Bush administration, thinking that, well, there goes the court. But perhaps I think one of the things that I've heard many people argue is that he's really in a position of trying to protect the institution itself and perhaps his reputation. I think maybe he's hedging and thinking that America will survive, and that if the history of the future looks back on him, he would like to be viewed more than just as a conservative apparatchik. What would you say to that?
I think that's absolutely right. I think John Roberts, and this is probably especially true when it comes to abortion, but it's true with a lot of things concerning our democracy. He's afraid of damaging his reputation, and he's also afraid of a popular backlash. And a backlash would be really likely, in fact, if the court overruled Roe in a very clear way, because we've seen lots of polls suggesting that most people don't want Roe to be overturned. And the other thing Roberts is, other than concerned with the court's reputation, is he's very intelligent and cunning. And so I think if progressives are worried about abortion rights, you have to really watch him, because he might be rolling back abortion rights in a stealthy way that's less obvious for people and less likely to trigger a backlash. But I think to some degree, I think his concern with the court's reputation and his own legacy is sincere, and that might act as some kind of protection for Roe and other precedents going forward.
So the moral of the story is, don't get too excited about what seems to be a progressive leaning now, John Roberts, because he has a lot more up his sleeve.
Absolutely, and read between the lines. I think John Roberts writes opinions that are technical and hard to read. And so often the kind of headline will be one that progressives feel good about, and the details will not be. And so sometimes if you're kind of wanting to figure out what John Roberts is doing, you might need to, read a couple op-eds or talk to a couple experts before you get to the really nitty-gritty of what happened.
In your book, you start discussing how there's a lot of focus on the Supreme Court when it comes to the issue of Roe versus Wade, or abortion in general, not just Roe versus Wade. How would you separate? How should we look at abortion outside of the context of the Supreme Court in terms of the right to abortions and the fight for or against abortion?
I think probably the biggest mistake progressives have made is to focus too much on national politics in general. So the big story, if you kind of go back several decades, has been the really complete capture by conservatives of state legislatures and an explosion in abortion restrictions following the Tea Party wave in 2010. And part of that was in some ways because progressives didn't care as much about state legislatures and weren't investing as much money and time in state legislatures. And so on a lot of issues, that's true with, voting and other things too. There's relevant issues unfolding at the state level all the time. And so I think it's easy to and important, of course, to pay attention to the kind of big ticket, sexy races like the race for the White House or the race to control the Senate. But when you're thinking about some of these really core issues like abortion, a lot of what matters is happening at the state level. The other thing I think probably is just we often tend to think about American abortion politics as being dysfunctional. It's one of many areas where if you look over, for example, at Europe, they're just not having the same kind of fights we are. And a lot of that gets pinned on the Supreme Court because our abortion rights came to us through a judicial decision rather than through a democratic outcome. I think if you dig into why the polarization got so bad, and how we got to a point where we can't even agree on the facts anymore, it has to do with a lot more than the Supreme Court. So some of it is just sort of realizing that there's a lot of blame on a lot of people's shoulders, not just on the 5 to 7 people who are giving us these Supreme Court decisions.
Evangelicals and perhaps even some Catholics originally were not even opposed to abortion. Jerry Falwell himself was not directly willing to get involved with abortions, but somehow it evolved into being like the #1 culture war issue, particularly for evangelicals and a lot of anti-abortion Catholics. Could you speak on that specifically in terms of what you just said about how there's a lot more connected to this fight and to the struggle and the inability to discuss facts because of the polarization of the issue?
Yeah, well, one of the biggest distinctions, obviously Roe v. Wade is part of the problem in the sense that Roe v. Wade gave conservatives like a single bullseye to aim at. But the other thing that happened, of course, is that abortion in America is a political party issue. And it's really hard for me, for one, to imagine Donald Trump being president without the abortion issue. There were many abortion opponents who did not like Donald Trump, did not trust Donald Trump, thought Donald Trump was a morally questionable person, and yet voted for him because they wanted the chance to control the Supreme Court and overturn Roe. And so I think political parties in America make our abortion politics more dysfunctional. And they've, in part, I think, rallied conservative evangelicals and Catholics to make abortion more of a political issue and to tap into views that evangelicals and some conservative Catholics have about related issues, whether that's contraception or the roles of women outside the home.
Some of the language that's used in when they talk about picking a judicial pick or a judicial nominee, you pointed out is the language is against judicial activism, and that anytime we hear that, that really is code word for abortion / Roe versus Wade. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, in the 80s, Ronald Reagan realized that there were some Republicans who were uncomfortable with an explicit pledge to reverse Roe v. Wade or nominate pro-life judges. And so judicial activism was a convenient way to rally both pro-lifers who wanted that commitment and other Republicans who were either uncomfortable with it or wanted some kind of abstract commitment to the rule of law. One of the striking things about that, of course, is that on Monday, Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri actually warned President Trump that conservatives wouldn't be voting for him unless he could explicitly guarantee judges who would no longer claim to be neutral, right, but who would vow to overturn Roe v. Wade. So we're seeing on the right a movement toward more and more explicitly and obviously strong promises to get rid of Roe v. Wade. So that's moving, I think, even further along the continuum in a conservative direction.
What is the pathway, if any, towards the culmination of this fight, right? I understand the complexity and the length, and this is going to take some time, but in terms of our side, in terms of the people who are fighting for a woman's right to choose, is there a way that we should change our language, our understanding of the issue, the way we communicate about it, the way we even organize around it? Is there anything that we can do to help expedite this fight, or at least get the odds in our favor?
The things that I think strike me as the most important is focusing on poorer women. If you look at progressive organizing for a long time is focused on legality, not on access. Whereas in reality, women with money and pregnant people with money have always had an easier time accessing abortion, regardless of what the law says. The other thing I think that progressives can do that's really important is to focus on the issues that tend to lead more people to wanting or seeking abortion, whether that's access to sex education or adequate birth control, or even adequate maternal health outcomes or freedom from pregnancy discrimination at work. The abortion rate is going down, and that doesn't have to be a bad thing if progressives are helping more people decide when they want to have children, when they're ready.
Mary Ziegler is a Stearns Weaver Miller Professor at Florida State University College of Law. Her book is Abortion in America, A Legal History, Roe versus Wade to the Present. Thanks so much for joining us, Mary.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching this free clip of the Young Turks. Don't forget to become a TYT member today. For more exclusive content, join now at tyt.com/join.